It wasn't old age. It was the way everyone suddenly began speaking to her more slowly, as if life itself now required subtitles she had never asked for. It was the careful touch on her elbow, the artificial gentleness in the voices saying, "Don't you worry, Elba will take care of it," with that syrupy tone that smells like a key turning in someone else's lock. What hurt her wasn't an illness that never existed, but the quiet suspicion that grew inside her like dampness spreading across a white wall. Someone had decided her mind was fallow ground, ready for a lie to be sown. Elba was 74, with the calm of a woman who had already buried too many. In her gaze there was a stillness, a refuge. Those who crossed paths with her in the breadline, at the corner pharmacy, or having her usual half coffee at Café Central, never too strong, never too short, noticed the quiet way she existed, neither swallowed by the world nor pushed along by it. Elba knew every shadow of her apartment in La Maligata, how the Mediterranean light climbed up the living room wall at 8:20 in May and at 8:35 in September. She could name smells with surgical precision. The dry oil of morning, the cheap detergent in the stairwell, the neighbor's breakfast eggs fried far beyond reason. And she could name silences too. Amancio's silence, broad and filled with breadcrumbs and poorly timed jokes. And the silence that came after he died, different, rough, laced with ground glass. Amancio's heart gave out at the end of summer, on a Sunday heavy with heat, when the city felt emptier than usual. They had walked down to Muel Uno to watch the boats. He stopped before La Farola and said, "Look how clean the light is," and before Elba could even gather the phrase, something faltered inside him. She caught him as best she could, with a dignity she would later recognize as a brutal mix of love and instinct, and she whispered that she wouldn't let him fall all the way. She kept her word. At the Persimasa funeral home, too cold to weep naturally, she placed a humble photo on the coffin, Amancio in a white shirt, a small smile, a sardine skewered on a spit at Pedregalejo. That's when Elba understood she was alone in a new way. That loneliness seeps in through the cracks one ignores when there's still someone around to make noise. In the mornings, she caught herself speaking aloud to the coffee pot. She took short walks to the Atarazanas market, where color felt like an honest kind of comfort, silver fish, fruit split open like sweet wounds, the stained glass arch retelling a modernist dream of a past no one really lived. Every Monday she bought a couple of biznagas from the corner florist, orange blossoms pinned to wooden stems, so her house would smell of promises. She learned to clean slowly, to fold sheets as if taming a restless thought, to sit by the window with the radio low while the city breathed. Then Amalia arrived, with those spellbinding eyes of a daughter-in-law who knows she's indispensable, and Ernesto followed, Elba's son, walking as though afraid to brush against something fragile and break it. They came one gray afternoon, the kind where the sea looks like tarnished metal. Amalia brought a bag of donuts from the Obrador de Larios and a well-rehearsed expression of pity. She spoke first of loss, of grief, of how hard everything must be at your age. Elba answered with the silence of someone unwilling to yield ground. Amalia went on about the house, about making sensible decisions, about ensuring your well-being, Elba. "I'm fine," Elba said, calm, her voice like a stone placed firmly to block the curious. "No one doubts that, mother," Amalia replied, squeezing her arm with a touch that pretended tenderness. "But there are papers. A notary. Don't take it the wrong way. Ernesto and I only want to help. I spoke with someone sometimes, well, the mind, isn't what it used to be. And in those cases, by law, someone can be appointed, just a temporary guardian, to prevent any rash decisions." Elba heard in Amelia's words the shimmer of business. It wasn't the first time she'd seen greed wrapped in gift paper. Ernesto's eyes, though, were those of a child caught in a game he didn't understand. Elba had learned to love him in this complicated form. A 47-year-old man still needing his mother's approval, always searching for it in the wrong places. "Rash decisions," Elba repeated, her tone burnished iron, shining without cutting. "Like selling the house." Amalia smiled, but her mouth didn't move. It was a smile of the eyes. It could be for the best, she said. That money would let you live comfortably, and we could take care of everything, just for a while. The notary could review your situation, make an assessment. It's the normal thing. Elba got up for some water, walking down the hallway at her own pace. Passing the bedroom, she caught the faint trace of Amancio's cologne, that deep well of clean man, and it brushed her side like a ghost. She inhaled, came back with a straight glass, one of the simple ones they'd always used from an unpretentious set. There will be no notary without my consent, she said, fixing her gaze the way nails hold heavy pictures. And my consent is not on sale. Amalia pressed her lips together. Ernesto looked down. Shame lingered in his posture, but also a fatigue that smelled of red numbers. Elba recognized the signs. Amalia's so-called experience boutique had been a fragile venture. Plenty of Instagram, few receipts. The days that followed stretched like tired gum. Calls, messages, knocks on the door that weren't the postman's. Amalia persisted with a blend of affection and urgency. She spoke of deadlines, of the bank's pressure, of how wise it is to accept help in time. Elba listened, breathed, said nothing. The word incapacity stuck in her throat like an invisible bone. Then, as if someone had turned on a lamp in the corridor of memory, she remembered an old conversation. It had been the winter before Amancio's death, on a rainy morning. They were sitting in the living room, watching the water slide down the balcony railing with the discipline of something ancient. Amancio had made one of his clumsy coffees, too much sugar, and then with the measured precision of men who have rehearsed a gesture for months, he said, "There may be things I've done that you won't like, Elbita, but none of them will hurt you. There are decisions I made so that no one can take our dignity away, not even our own." She looked at him the way one looks at a man who has sealed his honor in an envelope. She didn't ask. Some things you only come to understand later. Elba went to the bedroom and knelt before the oak dresser. She opened the bottom drawer. The one Amancio always claimed was jammed so no one would touch it. Nothing was broken. It resisted, then yielded the way memories do. Inside were shirts folded with affection. Beneath them, old newspapers, a Malaga scarf that still smelled of the stadium. And at the very back, a manila envelope with her name on it. For Elba. When I'm gone. She sat on the bed with the envelope in her hands. The paper had a rough, honest texture, like Amancio's hands when he smoked sardines over an open flame. Elba opened it with scissors, unhurried. Inside were two things: a serious blue notebook bearing the Banco Sabadell logo, and a type sheet with the address of a branch on the Alameda Principal. There were also copies of bank transactions and a short letter, written in Amancio's slow, deliberate handwriting. "Elba, I'm not a man of secrets, but this one is for your protection. Years ago, when we saw what some ambitions were made of, I decided to keep what's ours apart from what others insist on calling ours. It's not against them, it's for your peace. The house has been in your name since 2002. No one knows because no one asks questions they don't want answers to, and you shouldn't have had to carry that burden. At Banco Sabadell there's an account that doesn't say much but holds enough. The savings from my work, the ones we hid from other people's troubles. You'll also see transfers under Ernesto's and Amalia's names. They're not gifts, though you always said children shouldn't have to pay. They're loans and they're signed. Don't argue, show. Don't defend, breathe. I met you strong and you deserve to finish strong. You're Amancio." The tremor that ran through Elba's fingers wasn't fear. It felt as if someone had smoothed her hair from the inside. She caressed the blue notebook as if it were the forehead of a loyal animal. Her eyes grew damp, but she didn't cry. At her age, tears no longer spill easily. They stay inside, doing their quiet work, like a fine rain that only those who know where to look can hear. The next morning, Elba dressed with discreet elegance. Dark trousers, a white blouse, a polka-dot scarf at her neck. Not to seduce anyone, but to remind herself of the soft weight of dignity. She stepped onto the sidewalk, greeted the doorman, crossed La Malegata with the familiarity of someone who's counted the steps 100 times. On the Alameda Principal, traffic moved with that peculiar blend of patience and hurry that defines Malaga. She entered the Banco Sabadell branch. The air conditioning felt like a borrowed skin. Around her, clients stared at their phones as if waiting for the future to fix itself. She asked to see the manager. She did it with that kind of courtesy that isn't offered but quietly asserted. They led her to an office where the corporate blue almost matched the sea if one closed their eyes. She showed him the notebook, the document, her ID. The manager, a young man with a precisely trimmed beard, read through the papers with the gravity of someone trying to outrun time. On his screen appeared figures, transfers, a quiet story breathing behind the numbers. "Here it is, Dona Elba," he said. "The account in your name with the funds. And this," he pointed to a file, "these are the loan contracts signed by Don Amancio and the borrowers, your son and daughter-in-law. Everything in order." "In order?" Elba asked without edge. "That'll do." The manager cleared his throat. He explained patiently that the paperwork was sound, that the transfers had been formalized as loans, with dates, symbolic interest, and deadlines long expired. He handed her certified copies and gently suggested she might visit a notary to register a payment claim if needed. Elba listened with the focused calm of a craftswoman. When she stepped back outside, the November sun revealed the dust floating in the light, as if someone had opened an old book right there in the street. The following days were for waiting and preparing. Elba stored the papers in a gray folder with elastic bands. She reviewed the house documents, deeds in her name since 2002, exactly as the letter said. A quiet change Amancio had made a year after Ernesto and Amalia had asked them for one final push for their business. Elba tied the threads together with delicate precision. That summer when Amalia began talking about emotional investments, those dinners where everything was planning and no one washed the dishes, the loan granted without fuss, because in your 40s, you still believe love can settle accounts. That same year, Amancio had locked the house down. Not out of distrust but foresight. The difference matters. One comes from fear, the other from responsibility. Then Amalia called again. She wanted to speed up the notary process. She mentioned an appointment at a notary's office on Calle Larios. Elba said yes, surprising even her own voice. She hung up, exhaled, walked into the kitchen, and rested her forehead against the cool tiles, as if they were offering her a blessing. The notary's office was so clean it felt like a hospital. Glass gleamed, the floors held no footprints, and the silence had that clinical echo where even pins make a sound. Amalia arrived in beige trousers and a blouse that smelled faintly of magazine pages. Ernesto trailed behind, distracted, holding a flimsy plastic cup of coffee. The notary, a woman with an efficient gaze, greeted them with a smile that promised nothing. She began with simple questions. Names, dates, addresses. Elba answered with crisp precision. Amalia, on the other hand, talked too much. She spoke of best interests, recommendations, cognitive well-being. The notary, with the calm patience of a teacher who doesn't rush, asked for medical reports. "There are none," said Amalia. "But the situation, it's obvious. She's alone, she suffers from memory loss." Elba knew at once that word, obvious, was a mirror she refused to look into. She opened the gray folder with the composure of someone peeling fruit. She laid the certified bank copies on the table, then the house deeds, and finally, a short letter she had written with the help of the bank manager. A friendly payment request addressed to Ernesto and Amalia, listing the amounts loaned, the dates, the symbolic interest rate, and a proposed repayment schedule. "Perhaps what's obvious," said Elba without raising her voice, "is something else. Paper makes a sound when it touches wood." Amalia heard it like a silent gunshot. The notary read. Her face remained neutral, but the lift of one eyebrow told a whole story of family surprises. Ernesto rubbed the back of his neck. There was sweat. Truth can be feverish. "Dona Elba," said the notary, "everything here is quite clear. There is no basis at this time for any judicial request regarding capacity. You respond with precision, and your documentation is impeccable. As for the other matter, she looked at Ernesto and Amalia. The payment request is correct. I suggest you review it with your lawyer. Amalia attempted a smile that fell apart halfway. Mother, she said in that voice that tries to slip back into family after business, we didn't know, we didn't mean. Neither did I, interrupted Elba, for the first time allowing the edge of the phrase to cut. Neither did I. But here we are. Silence spread, lasting as long as it takes a train to cross a city. Outside, Calle Larios held its stretched-out shadows, neatly combed by the afternoon. For a split second, Elba felt the urge to reach out, to mend what was unraveling with that ancient maternal gesture. Instead, she chose to hold on to her folder and her pulse. Ernesto, she said to her son, and in her mouth the name carried both the warmth of fresh bread and the creak of an old door. You owe me the truth. Amalia owes me the papers. He nodded without swallowing. On his face was a boy apologizing for things he couldn't yet name. Elba felt a sharp pang. Guilt is sometimes a dog that bites when you try to rescue it. That night, the house smelled of orange blossom and nearby sea. Elba made a simple broth, turned on a warm light in the living room, opened the window just enough to let the sound in. She sat in her usual armchair and went over the day's events with the unhurried rhythm of a woman peeling potatoes. There was no victory, not yet. There was order. An order at a certain age looks a lot like peace. The days that followed beat with the steady rhythm of a calm city. Elba resumed her walks. One morning, slowly, she climbed the steps of Mount Gibralfaro. She stopped to look down at the port, at the cranes bending their metallic necks, at La Farola standing like a white finger pointing toward the sky. She sat on a bench and let the sun warm her knees. She thought of Amancio with a gratitude that widened her chest. He hadn't been a hero. He'd simply understood the trap set by those closest to him and chosen to move before the blows landed. A man with flaws, how tiresome that midnight cough, that habit of keeping useless screws, but with a sense of duty that Elba found almost erotic in its restraint. The way he paid the electric bill before vacations, the envelopes of exact cash for emergencies, the lists written in his square handwriting. Some men promised the world. Amancio had promised what was possible, and he'd kept his word. One afternoon Ernesto called. His tone wasn't one of plea or threat. It sounded more like the way he used to ask as a boy, for permission to go to the beach with friends. He wanted to see her, to talk. Elba agreed. They met at a bar in Pedregulillo, in front of overturned fishing boats that looked like giant fish gasping for air. They ordered 2 coffees. At times, Ernesto seemed on the verge of tears, at others like he could sleep for a week. I couldn't stop Amalia, he said, staring into the foam as if it were a map. I couldn't stop myself. I got swallowed by the rush. Elba didn't absolve him. She didn't condemn him either. Sometimes love is just that, not adding weight where there's already enough. Will you pay the money back? She asked, her tone polished steel. Yes, Ernesto said. I don't know how yet, but yes. I've spoken with the bank. I can sell my car. And Amalia. She's looking for a real job. I found one too. At a small accounting firm. I don't like it, but it pays. Liking it, said Elba, is a luxury for teenagers and the rich. They both laughed, briefly, softly. The sea had that blue it only allows itself after the Levant wind. Elba watched a couple walking hand in hand with the tender awkwardness of new lovers. She felt a nostalgia that didn't ache. It was quieter than that, like the body remembering it had once been touched with respect. There was a process. Small, steady, formal. A lawyer did his job. Repayment agreements were signed with modest deadlines. Amalia, now more measured, returned to the notary's office, this time to close matters that required no gestures, only pens. Elba wasn't vindictive. She could have pressed harder but chose not to. She gave it a name. Justice isn't done by placing a new wound on top of an old one. With the house, Elba did what no one expected. She didn't sell it. She wanted to stay, among her familiar lights. She rented out Ernesto's old room, not out of need but for company and a touch of discipline. Her tenant was a student of fine arts, a patient-eyed girl who painted fruit as if she were coaxing out their secrets with the tip of her brush. Her name was Vera, she was from Jane, and she had that rare gift of listening without turning it into a performance. On summer nights, Elba and Vera would sit on the balcony with 2 glasses of cold water, talking about nothing. The lady from the 5th floor who bought more bread than hunger, the exact color of an orange at 7 in the evening, and how sometimes one can save oneself from their own people without losing them entirely. Elba restarted her rituals. Every Sunday she went to the cathedral, not out of fierce faith but habit. She liked the wooden pews, the faint music that doesn't need belief to comfort. She bought bread from the Tahona and olives from the corner shop, as always. Sometimes, when her body asked for it, she'd take a taxi to the CAC Museum and stand before a painting that unsettled her just enough to feel alive. She learned a small, deep truth. Time doesn't heal, but it arranges, and sometimes that's enough to make the pain bearable. One gesture, seemingly small, was in fact an act of sovereignty. She walked into the office of a sober accountant, a man with a cheap tie and clean hands, and dictated her will. She did it without secrets for those who mattered. Ernesto would receive what was fair. No punishments, no rewards. The rest she left divided. Part to a neighborhood association that helped elderly people living alone, another to the restoration of a church altarpiece that Amancio had always loved. She wanted things, when she was gone, to fall into a straight line without forks or detours. But she didn't live for that moment. She lived still for the mornings, each alike and yet new in La Malagueta. She allowed herself an irrational purchase. A fine coffee maker, one of those that looks like a small statue. She smiled when she tasted the first perfect cup. There was no urge to share it on any chat. Some pleasures, she told herself, work better when only the heart hears them. There were crooked days, of course. Loneliness doesn't leave just because you've beaten it once. It comes back wearing other faces, carrying again the shadow of someone pulling a paper from your hand, the temptation to give in out of exhaustion. On one of those days, Amalia appeared at the door. She came up, knocked softly, and entered without that invasive perfume she once favored. She sat on the edge of the sofa. "I came to thank you," she said, her voice trembling with the humility of someone who's finally found an unpainted mirror. "If you'd wanted to, you could have destroyed us. You didn't." A tenderness rose in Elba from some deep place. She remembered Amalia young, laughing loud, dancing in the kitchen the day they celebrated the engagement with Ernesto. She remembered her hunger for the center of attention, her appetite for the world. Some of that still flickered beneath the fatigue. "That's something you'll have to tell yourself," said Elba. "I just put the papers where they belonged." Amalia spoke about her new job at a clinic, her long hours, her honest tiredness. She spoke, more carefully, of the therapy sessions every Tuesday, of the shame she'd had to swallow. They didn't ask for forgiveness with trumpets. They didn't make pacts. They spoke like 2 women who know how much it costs to keep a life standing. That night, Elba walked farther than usual. She went down to the beach. The lights formed a long necklace along the shore. The sea was calm, its rhythm so steady it seemed to match her own pulse if she listened long enough. She stopped to look at a small fishing boat with its name painted in blue, Paciencia. She thought of Amancio, how he would have made a short joke about that name. She spoke inwardly. "See? I'm still here." The wind brought her the scent of sardines, of wood and salt. At Easter, Elba did what she had always done, tried not to be swallowed by the crowds and processions, but went out at least one day, just one, to watch. She chose the Cristo de Mina. She saw men with clean tears, women in mantillas that looked like black clouds caught in time. She saw a city suddenly united in quiet speech. She understood that beyond faith or the lack of it, there was something communal that held her up too, even if she hadn't asked for it. On her way home, the smell of candle wax followed her down the hallway, and for the first time in a long while, the silence in her living room didn't bite, it kept her company. The months slipped by like water through a narrow canal. Ernesto kept paying bit by bit, the papers breathing honesty. Amalia sometimes stopped by with bread or to change a light bulb, without the martyr's face. Vera painted grapes that looked more real than those at the market. One June afternoon, the girl asked Elba to rest her hands on a table for a light study. "You have wise hands," she said. Elba blushed, surprised by the warmth of it. Not vanity but recognition. In those hands lived the pots and pans, the diapers, the envelopes, the creases of the world. She let them be seen. Elba didn't romanticize anything, but she was grateful for what was real. When her pension came in, she would sit and arrange her expenses with a patience that smelled of fresh ink. "There's always someone who despises numbers," she liked to say, "until numbers bite them back." And she smiled, thinking of Amancio, of his habit of saving coins in an old olive jar. One day, without warning, she dreamed of the dawn when Amancio left. In the dream there was no ambulance, no noise, only a boat drifting slowly away, and her standing on the dock silent. When she woke, she felt a kind of relief she hadn't expected. Grief, she thought, is sometimes a letter that arrives too late, and when it does, you no longer need to read it aloud. By the time another autumn came, the city felt like a house that had decided to be kind. The afternoons once again stretched their oblique shadows across the living room. Elba placed a blanket over the back of the sofa, put on water for chamomile tea, and opened the gray folder, out of habit more than necessity. The loan copies were nearly settled. The house deeds had lost their power to startle. The blue bank notebook rested quietly, asleep. She understood something simple. What had begun as defense had become a place to rest. Not a trench but a porch. Not a war but a threshold. Sometimes neighbors came to visit, women who carried stories that needed to leave the body. Elba served coffee, listened, and only offered advice when foolishness insisted. As she watched them gesture, their rings loose on fingers, their nails painted with effort, Elba felt that gentle pride of still being here. Not like a rock merely existing, but like a woman who chooses, again and again, what to let inside and what to leave at the door. Not always possible, of course. That wasn't the point. The point was in the small daily scenes, the keys on the table by the door, the hum of the elevator, the first sip of coffee, the breeze that slipped through the window and moved the curtain as if the sea itself were breathing. It was about keeping her name where it belonged on the deed, about placing her finger on the line and saying without shouting, "This far." It was about the moment someone tried to reduce her to a passive subject, and she answered with better grammar, subject and verb. One ordinary afternoon, Elba went down to Muel Uno with Vera. They bought lemon ice cream and sat on a bench watching tourists shuffle by in sandals and sunburned skin. The light was a generous pact between autumn and summer, a kind golden glow. Vera showed her a photo of a new painting, a table with bread, a vase of bisnagas, the shadows of two chairs touching. Elba felt a tremor at her core. It wasn't sorrow or joy. It was that third state that comes when you've settled your accounts with the past and can finally look at objects without giving them more meaning than they hold. "Is it good?" the girl asked, with the honest uncertainty of someone who knows art always asks permission. "It's at peace," said Elba, "and that, when it happens, is a civil miracle." That night back home, Elba opened the balcony. The city smelled of dinner and fading conversations. It occurred to her that maybe Amancio, with his blue notebook and brief letter, had built her a secret passage, a way to cross a dangerous stretch without being hurt. It wasn't a treasure, not a spectacular surprise. It was a penciled map. And sometimes that saves more than any grand gesture. Precision, foresight, patience. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Ernesto. "Mom, I finished paying. Thank you." Elba stroked the screen the way one might pet the back of a cat that no longer lives with you. She turned off the light, sat on the edge of the bed. Perhaps it was the first night, since Amancio's death, that sleep came to her without asking for explanations. It wasn't old age. It was the way the world had finally learned to speak her language. No one stretched their vowels anymore, no one explained the obvious. Sometimes Amalia left a small bag of bread hanging on the door, without ringing. Sometimes Ernesto called, not about money but about the weather, a dog he'd met at the park, a recipe. Sometimes Vera took her picture without warning, later showing her those hands that, she said, hold the air itself. Elba had gained a serenity that made no sound, the kind that remains after one has taken the small step that was needed. She had no illusions. She knew time collects its dues, that the body announces its weariness with new aches, that memory plays tricks as it must, and that one day, quietly, someone would remove her name from a mailbox and stop leaving letters inside. But meanwhile, the house kept its slow breathing, the walls held a gentle warmth, the cups found their places, the papers lay where they should, the sea brought its murmur, tamed by the horizon. In Malaga, the light did what it always does, arrived uninvited. On calm afternoons, Elba sat in her chair with a glass of water, the blue notebook tucked away like a secret no longer needed, only a reminder that once she had known how to say no, and that had kept her standing. And when she closed her eyes, what she heard was not the fear of losing her will, nor the haste of others to manage her life. What she heard was the quiet heartbeat of her own decision. Some victories are celebrated in the streets. Others are recorded only in a gesture, a clean plate, a full night's sleep. Elba's belonged to the latter. And yet, anyone watching her walk down the Alameda, or pay for bread at the bakery, would sense it, the subtle change in the way she placed her foot, in the tone of her good morning. It wasn't pride. It was ownership. At last, her life belonged to her, as naturally as an open window in a house that smells of bisnaga. It wasn't old age. It was the light, coming back through the place it had always wanted to enter. And a phrase unspoken now that she no longer needs to say, yet it shows on her face like a well-healed scar. Everything that is mine because I kept it with patience.